There is a place on this earth where the ground itself seems to be boiling, where the air shimmers so violently that distant mountains appear to melt into the sky, where the color of the land shifts from sulfur yellow to acid green to a red so deep it looks like the planet is bleeding. This is not another world. It is a corner of Ethiopia in a desert basin that sits lower than the sea, where the average temperature never really drops, where salt has been mined by hand for longer than most nations have existed, and where people still live, still work, still raise families, in conditions that would kill most of us within a day. But Ethiopia is not only this furnace. Barely a day's drive away, the same country rises into cool green highlands more than 2 kilometers into the sky, where farmers wrap themselves in thick shawls at dawn, and coffee, the very coffee the world drinks every morning, grows wild in misty forest shade. This is a nation of extremes held inside one set of borders, a place that keeps its own calendar, its own clock, and in many ways, its own sense of time itself. If you are just arriving, welcome. Consider subscribing before we go further, because we are about to descend into the hottest place on this planet, and then climb into one of its coolest, oldest, and most independent civilizations. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching this from. Let's begin at the bottom of the earth, in a depression that never stops burning. In the far northeast of Ethiopia, hard against the border with Eritrea, the ground drops below sea level and keeps dropping. This is the Danakil Depression, part of a larger triangular basin where 3 of the Earth's tectonic plates are slowly tearing apart from one another. Geologists call it a triple junction. It is one of the very few places on the planet where you can watch, in real time, the crust of the Earth pulling itself in 3 directions at once. And the result is a landscape that looks less like a desert and more like the surface of another planet. Sitting more than 100 meters below sea level in places, the Danakil holds the record for the hottest average annual temperature recorded anywhere on the planet's surface, hovering somewhere in the mid-30s Celsius across the entire year, with no real winter to offer relief. On an ordinary afternoon, the mercury can climb past 50 degrees. There is almost no rainfall, and whatever moisture does fall evaporates within hours, leaving behind the thick crust of salt that gives this basin its strange cracked beauty. Wander further in, and the ground turns psychedelic. At a site called Dalal, hydrothermal vents push up mineral-rich water that stains the earth in shades of turmeric, lime, and rust, forming pools so acidic that scientists study them as the closest thing on Earth to conditions on early Mars. Not far away, the crater of Erta glows through the night with an active lava lake, one of the very few on the planet that has remained continuously molten for generations. And yet, none of this is empty land. The Afar people have called this region home for thousands of years, and their relationship with the Danakil is not one of visiting an extreme environment. It is their environment. Traditionally, nomadic pastoralists, the Afar herd goats and camels across some of the most punishing terrain on the planet, moving with the rhythm of scarce water rather than a calendar. And it is here, on the dry lake bed of the Danakil, that Afar miners still walk out onto the salt flats each morning and cut slabs of pure white salt from the earth by hand, using axes and wooden poles, exactly as their fathers and grandfathers did. Once cut, the salt is shaped into flat bricks, loaded onto strings of camels, and led on multi-day marches across the desert to trading towns in the highlands, a route their ancestors have walked for centuries, with caravans sometimes stretching to dozens of animals moving in a single disciplined line across the horizon. That salt once functioned as a form of currency in its own right, traded in bars called amoli in the most remote corners of the country. A reminder of just how central this white mineral has been to Ethiopian economic life. It is grueling, unglamorous work carried out under conditions that would be considered medically dangerous almost anywhere else on Earth. And it endures because it always has. Even as trucks now carry a growing share of the load that camels once bore alone. Climb out of the Danakil and drive west, and Ethiopia transforms completely. More than 80% of all the land in Africa that sits above 3,000 meters in elevation is found within Ethiopia's borders. And this highland plateau, split down its length by the Great Rift Valley, is where the vast majority of the country's population actually lives. The capital, Addis Ababa, sits at roughly 2,400 meters, making it one of the highest capital cities anywhere in the world. Cool enough that visitors expecting African heat are often surprised to find themselves reaching for a jacket in the evening. Ethiopia's highest peak, Ras Dashen in the Simien Mountains, rises past 4,500 meters. And the Simien Range itself, a jagged UNESCO World Heritage landscape of sheer escarpments and plunging valleys, is sometimes called the roof of Africa. It is here, among the cliffs, that troops of Gelada monkeys graze the high grasslands in the thousands, an animal found nowhere else on Earth, and nicknamed for the crimson patch of skin across its chest. Further south, in the Bale Mountains, the Ethiopian wolf hunts alone across an Afro-alpine plateau, the rarest wild dog species on the planet and Africa's only native wolf. Between these two extremes, the scorched Danakil floor and the misty Highland peaks, Ethiopia holds nearly every climate zone imaginable. And it is this dramatic range of geography that has shaped everything about how Ethiopians live, eat, and understand their own country. It is genuinely difficult to think of another single nation on Earth where you could stand in the hottest recorded place on the planet in the morning and by nightfall be shivering in highland fog thousands of meters above it. Water tells its own version of this story. Northwest of the capital, Lake Tana spreads out as Ethiopia's largest lake, a vast highland basin dotted with small islands that hold some of the country's oldest monasteries, their walls covered in centuries of religious paintings that monks still maintain today. Lake Tana is also the source of the Blue Nile, and roughly 30 kilometers downstream from the lakeside city of Bahir Dar. That same river throws itself over a wide basalt cliff at the Blue Nile Falls, known locally as Tissa Bay, or Smoking Water, a name earned from the clouds of spray that rise from the gorge below during the rainy season. From here, the Blue Nile begins a long, dramatic journey north and west, eventually meeting the White Nile in Sudan to form the river that has sustained civilizations for thousands of years, which means that a meaningful share of the water flowing past the pyramids of Egypt began its journey as rainfall on an Ethiopian mountainside. It is a quiet, often overlooked fact that this landlocked highland nation, more associated in outside imagination with drought than abundance, is in reality one of the most important sources of fresh water anywhere on the African continent. Daily life in Ethiopia is, unsurprisingly, shaped first by elevation. In the highlands, where most of the population lives, mornings begin cool and clear, and the rhythm of the day is still deeply tied to agriculture. Small farms terrace the hillsides, growing teff, the tiny nutrient-dense grain that is unique to this part of the world and that underpins the single most important dish in Ethiopian life, injera. Injera is a wide, spongy, faintly sour flatbread made by fermenting teff batter for several days before cooking it on a large, flat griddle. It arrives at the table not as a side dish, but as the plate itself, a soft round base onto which stews and vegetables are ladled directly. There is no cutlery. Diners tear off pieces of injera with their right hand and use it to scoop up whatever sits on top, and it is extremely common, almost expected, for a meal to be eaten from one shared platter rather than individual plates. Eating is rarely a solitary act here. It is a communal one, built around the idea that food, like most things in Ethiopian life, is meant to be shared. That same instinct toward gathering shows up most powerfully in coffee, and it is worth pausing here because Ethiopia is, by most accounts, the birthplace of coffee itself. The place where the plant first grew wild, and where the drink was first discovered. According to local legend, when a goat herder named Kaldi noticed his animals dancing with strange energy after eating red coffee berries. Whatever the truth of that story, coffee did not just originate here, it became ritual. The Ethiopian coffee ceremony, known locally as buna, is a slow, deliberate practice that can take the better part of an hour and is repeated daily in countless households. Fresh green beans are roasted over an open flame until the room fills with smoke and aroma, then ground by hand and brewed in a clay pot called a jabina. Traditionally over 3 separate rounds, each round considered slightly weaker and more contemplative than the last. Grass is sometimes scattered across the floor, incense burns nearby, and neighbors are invited to sit, talk, and drink together. It is not a quick espresso shot grabbed on the way to work. It is a structured pause built into the day, and to decline an invitation to a coffee ceremony without good reason would be considered a small social misstep in many communities. Homes across Ethiopia vary enormously depending on region and income. In Addis Ababa, a fast-growing capital now home to close to 6 million people in its greater metropolitan area, modern apartment towers rise beside dense, informal neighborhoods where corrugated metal roofs and narrow lanes reflect decades of rapid, sometimes chaotic urban growth. Out in the countryside, particularly in the south and among ethnic groups like the Dorzi, homes take far more distinctive forms, including tall, beehive-shaped bamboo structures woven so tightly they can stand for generations. In the Afar lowlands, shelters often lightweight and portable by necessity, built to be packed up and moved as herders follow water and grazing land. What ties these different domestic worlds together is less the architecture itself, and more the underlying expectation of hospitality. Across almost every region and ethnic group in Ethiopia, a guest, even an unexpected one, is offered food and coffee before business of any kind is discussed. It is one of the more consistent cultural threads in a country that is otherwise remarkably diverse. Getting around adds its own texture to daily life. In Addis Ababa, fleets of small blue and white taxis weave through streets alongside a light rail system that carries commuters across the city. While in smaller towns, 3-wheeled auto rickshaws, known locally as Bajaj, handle most short trips, and in rural areas it is still entirely normal to share the road with donkeys carrying firewood or water to market. Open-air markets remain central to how most Ethiopians shop and eat. From the sprawling Mercato in Addis Ababa, reputed to be one of the largest open-air markets anywhere on the continent, to smaller weekly markets in Highland towns where farmers bring produce, grain, and livestock down from surrounding villages. Clothing, too, still carries meaning here. On Sundays and religious holidays, it is common to see men and women dressed in white, hand-woven cotton garments with brightly colored woven borders, a traditional style still worn with pride, alongside increasingly common Western clothing in everyday city life. And Ethiopia's diversity is not a minor detail. It is one of the most ethnically and linguistically varied nations on Earth, home to more than 80 distinct ethnic groups and a comparable number of languages, with the Oromo forming the largest single group, followed by the Amhara, and significant populations of Somali, Tigrayan, Sidama, Afar, and dozens more. Roughly two-thirds of Ethiopians follow Christianity, most within the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest organized Christian institutions on earth, tracing its roots to the 4th century. Roughly one-third of the population is Muslim, alongside smaller communities of Ethiopian Jews and followers of traditional faiths. This is worth sitting with for a moment because so much of the popular imagination about this part of the world flattens it into a single story, when the reality is a mosaic that has coexisted, argued, traded, and intermarried across the same highland plateau for thousands of years. If there is one idea that threads through all of this variation, it may be Ethiopia's relationship with time itself, and its own independence from the systems around it. Ethiopia runs on its own calendar, a system with 13 months, 12 of 30 days each, and a short final month of 5 or 6 days, calculated differently from the Gregorian calendar the rest of the world uses, which leaves Ethiopia's official date running roughly 7 to 8 years behind the one most of the planet follows. The Ethiopian New Year, called Enkutataash, falls in September at the end of the rainy season, tying the calendar to the actual rhythm of the highland climate rather than an arbitrary date. Clocks work differently too. In traditional Ethiopian timekeeping, the day begins at sunrise rather than midnight. So what much of the world calls 7 o'clock in the morning is locally simply the first hour of the day. None of this is presented to the world as quaint folklore. It is simply how Ethiopia measures its own existence on its own terms, and that independence is not incidental. Ethiopia stands out in African history as the one nation that was never formally colonized by a European power, aside from a brief and fiercely resisted Italian occupation in the late 1930s. In 1896, at the Battle of Adwa, Ethiopian forces under Emperor Menelik II decisively defeated an invading Italian army, a victory that shocked European capitals and became, and remains, a defining symbol of African sovereignty and resistance to colonial rule. That pride is rooted in a genuinely ancient civilization. Long before Adwa, the kingdom of Aksum flourished here from roughly the 1st century onward, controlling trade routes along the Red Sea and developing its own writing system, Ge'ez, which still forms the basis of the script used to write Amharic today. Aksum adopted Christianity in the 4th century under King Ezana, making it one of the earliest Christian states on earth, centuries before most of Europe converted. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the Zagwe dynasty carved 11 churches directly out of solid volcanic rock at Lalibela, hollowing out entire buildings, windows, doorways, and all from single blocks of stone. Structures so extraordinary they remain active places of worship and pilgrimage today, and they now sit protected as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And in the Afar region, where the salt caravans still walk, scientists in 1974 uncovered the fossilized remains of a hominin more than 3 million years old, a discovery that came to be known worldwide as Lucy, one of the most important finds in the story of human origins. Ethiopia does not just have old buildings. In a very real sense, it may be where the human story itself begins. That deep religious history still plays out publicly every year in some of the most striking festivals anywhere on the continent. In late September, Ethiopians mark Meskel, a celebration of the finding of the true cross, by building a tall bonfire known as the Demera, decorated with yellow mescal daisies, which is set alight at sundown while crowds circle it singing and dancing, watching the direction the charred branches fall as a kind of omen for the year ahead. A few months later comes Timkat, the Ethiopian Orthodox celebration of Epiphany, when replicas of the Ark of the Covenant, are carried in candlelit procession from churches down to open water, followed the next morning by mass ceremonial baptisms, with entire towns, Lalibela and Gondar especially, turning their streets into rivers of white robes, chanting, and celebration. These are not staged tourist spectacles. They are lived, deeply felt expressions of a faith that has shaped this country for 17 centuries. And UNESCO has recognized mezcal as part of humanity's intangible cultural heritage. We're at the halfway point of this journey, and if this kind of deep, honest look at a country is something you enjoy, this is exactly the sort of channel worth sticking around for. So, go ahead and hit subscribe before we move into the harder, more practical side of what life actually looks like here, because it would not be honest to leave you with only salt caravans and rock-hewn churches. Life in Ethiopia today comes with real, significant pressure, and any fair account of this country has to include it. Ethiopia's economy has, on paper, been one of the fastest growing in Africa in recent years, with strong annual growth driven by agriculture, construction, and mining. But that headline growth sits uneasily alongside a harder reality on the ground. According to World Bank estimates, the share of Ethiopians living in poverty actually rose sharply in the past decade, a reversal that reflects years of conflict, drought, and currency instability eating into everyday household budgets faster than the economy could lift them. The birr, Ethiopia's national currency, was significantly devalued in 2024 as part of a broader move toward a market-based exchange rate, a reform aimed at attracting investment and stabilizing the economy long-term, but one that immediately pushed up the price of imported goods, fuel, and basic supplies for ordinary families in the short term. Inflation has been persistently high for years, and while official figures showed it easing towards single digits by the end of 2025, many Ethiopians describe a widening gap between what the statistics say and what they actually feel at the market each week, particularly for food and rent. The vast majority of the workforce, roughly 4 out of every 5 workers, is still engaged in low-productivity agriculture or informal, unregulated work, meaning that national growth figures often do not translate evenly into higher wages or job security for the average family. There is also a harder truth about stability itself. Ethiopia has spent much of the last several years navigating serious internal conflict, most notably the war in the northern Tigray region between 2020 and 2022, which caused enormous human suffering and displacement before a peace agreement was signed in Pretoria in November of that year. That peace remains fragile. Tensions between federal authorities and armed groups have continued in parts of the Amhara and Oromia regions, and periodic flare-ups, including renewed friction in Tigray itself, have kept certain areas of the country under travel advisories from foreign governments. This is not a reason to define Ethiopia by conflict alone. In the same way, no single difficult chapter defines any nation of well over 100 million people. But anyone genuinely asking whether they could live here, rather than simply visit for a documentary, deserves the full picture. A country investing heavily in infrastructure, tourism, and its own growth, while still working through post-conflict recovery, currency reform, and real cost of living pressure that falls hardest on people with fixed incomes. Renting an apartment in central Addis Ababa now competes with international prices in ways that can feel jarring against local wages, even as housing in smaller towns and rural regions remains dramatically cheaper. Power outages, water shortages, and infrastructure gaps are still common outside the capital, and building a stable life here for a foreigner or an Ethiopian requires real patience with systems that are still very much under construction. There is also a persistent gap between the official exchange rate for the birr and the rate people actually pay on the informal market. a sign of ongoing foreign currency shortages that make imported goods, medical supplies, and even certain spare parts harder and more expensive to come by than the headline economic figures suggest. Public debt has also climbed substantially over the past decade, and the government has spent recent years in active negotiations with international creditors to restructure part of that load, all while trying to keep funding schools, clinics, and safety net programs for the country's poorest households. What is striking, though, is how little of this hardship translates into despair when you actually spend time with people here. There is a resilience running through daily Ethiopian life that shows up again and again, from the Afar men who still walk salt caravans across a landscape that could kill them, to families in Addis Ababa building new lives amid a currency in flux, to farmers in the Highlands adjusting to a changing climate one growing season at a time. It is a nation that has weathered invasion, drought, and internal conflict while still keeping its own calendar, its own alphabet, and its own unbroken sense of who it is. So, could you actually live here? Honestly, it depends enormously on where in the country you mean, and depends just as much on what you personally need from a place. If what you're looking for is convenience, predictability, and a cost of living that behaves the way it does back home, Ethiopia will test you, particularly right now, while currency reform and inflation are still working themselves out, and while parts of the north remain unsettled enough to warrant real caution. But if what you're looking for is depth, texture, a sense of history that is still breathing rather than fossilized behind museum glass, few places on Earth offer more of it per square kilometer. Life on the cool green plateau around Addis Ababa, with its coffee culture, its dense university scene, and its slowly modernizing skyline, is a world away from life among the Afar in the Danakil, where survival itself is the daily project, and both are a world away again from a quiet farming town in the Simeon foothills, where geladas graze on the hillside above the barley fields. Ethiopia does not offer one answer to that question, because it is not one country pretending to be many. It is genuinely many worlds inside a single, ancient, self-determined nation. What ties them together is not comfort, and it is certainly not ease. It is a kind of stubborn, dignified endurance, a refusal across thousands of years to be erased, colonized, or rewritten by anyone else's calendar. Think back to where we started, on that cracked, shimmering salt floor in the Danakil, in air so hot it seems to distort the light itself. It would be easy to look at that landscape and see only hardship, only a place no reasonable person would choose. But the Afar families who call it home did not arrive there by accident, and they have not stayed out of desperation alone. They stayed because it is theirs, because generations of knowledge about where the water is, when to move the herd, and how to read a salt flat are folded into that choice in ways an outsider driving through for an afternoon could never fully understand. The same is true, in gentler form, of a farmer terracing a highland hillside at 2,000 meters, or a grandmother in Addis Ababa timing the third pour of coffee just right. None of it is designed to impress a visitor. It simply is how life has always been organized here, on Ethiopian time, by Ethiopian hands. There is something quietly moving about a country that, even now, calculates its own date differently from almost everywhere else on Earth. That begins its clock at sunrise instead of midnight. That still shares its meals from a single plate and its mornings over a coffee ceremony that cannot be rushed. In a world increasingly synchronized to the same feeds, the same clocks, the same rhythms, Ethiopia continues deliberately to keep its own time. Whether that shows up in a salt miner shouldering a load beneath the hottest sun on the planet, or in a highland family lingering over the third round of coffee as the sun goes down, the message underneath it is the same. This is a place that has always insisted on being itself, on its own terms, regardless of what the rest of the world was doing. If a story like that is one you want more of, subscribe now, because there are many more corners of this planet and the people who call them home still waiting to be understood. Thank you for spending this time in Ethiopia with us. We'll see you in the next one.